Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Jonathan. If you're looking for short stories on a weekly basis, you've come to the right place. This is Taleteller's Universe. I've got another original story for you today. This one is not so much a horror as maybe a thriller. I like to try different stories, and I think this is a good one. Let me know in the comments what you think at the end. This story is called Hey Taxi! So without further ado, Hey Taxi by Jonathan Lee Wilson. Hey Taxi! Exclaimed Jeremiah Benson as he raised his hand in the air in front of the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Atlanta. Traffic was heavier than usual for a Monday morning. He had 45 minutes to pick up Sarah on the way to the courthouse, so not a moment to waste. Even dressed in his best suit, the taxi drivers were ignoring him as usual. For 6 months, he'd felt invisible, and it seemed he was right now. He wasn't a bad-looking guy, with his chestnut hair, blue eyes, and friendly smile. He wouldn't be winning any bodybuilding competitions, but his 5'10" frame filled his suit adequately. He was a friendly person and a devoted boyfriend to Sarah. Oh, come on. He was getting frustrated with the stream of yellow cabs whizzing past him. His time was just as important as the next guy in a double-breasted polyester blend suit off the rack at JCPenney. Why should he be treated this way? He needed to work on exhibiting more strength. Maybe if his body language exuded more strength, the universe would be more kind to him. I'm gonna be late. I promised Sarah I'd be on time for once. His exasperation was becoming evident on his face. He also knew Judge O'Connor was a stickler for punctuality in her court, so being late was an especially bad circumstance to find himself in. Just as he started to drop his arm in defeat, a black Ford Crown Victoria pulled out from the flow of traffic and stopped only 3 feet from his dress shoes. It appeared someone had taken an old police cruiser and converted it to a taxi. It lacked the lights, of course, but still had the ram bar standard on so many police vehicles. Emblazoned on the side was the word taxi. The roof lights on the old patrol car were replaced with a plastic sign as you would find on most cabs. Finally, Jeremiah thought to himself. He walked around to the driver's side and peered at the window. They were tinted, and the shape of a man moved to operate the window control. The driver continued looking forward as his window lowered 6 inches. "Do you need a ride?" he said in a thick European accent. He couldn't quite place it, but it sounded like it could be Russian. He wasn't sure. However, it seemed vaguely familiar. "Yes, please, thank you," Jeremiah said as he reached for the door. As he grasped the handle, a static shock tingled in his fingertips. A shiver went up his back. He seated himself and addressed the driver. "Hi, 107 Franklin Boulevard, please. We need to pick someone up," he said as he glanced around. "Very good," the driver said without moving an inch. He was a mountain of a man. His head was shaved bald, and he had a bushy mustache. His eyes were unseen through his mirrored aviator-style sunglasses. He wore a thick turtleneck sweater with leather epaulets on the shoulders. The driver started the meter and moved forward. Jeremiah barely had time to fasten his seatbelt before being tossed about by the momentum of the car. "Hey, careful, mister," he said to the mysterious driver. Jeremiah looked at the dashboard and saw the man's taxi permit. It read Nikola Petrovic. Nikola simply turned his head slightly to indicate he was looking at Jeremiah in the mirror and diverted his attention back to the road. Maybe it was some kind of language barrier, where the driver just didn't realize he was being a little rude. "Have you been driving for a long time?" he asked inquisitively. He was met with nothing but the reflection of the aviator glasses in the rearview mirror. Moments later, however, he finally spoke. 10 years I have been driving people to their destinations. I have never failed to deliver a passenger where they need to be and when they need to get there," he said with what seemed like a fair bit of pride. "How rude of me. My name is Nikola. What is your name?" he said, finally paying some real attention to his passenger. He cleared his throat and said, "My name is Jeremiah. Pleased to meet you." He noticed a small amount of lint on his jacket and picked it off. It was a nervous habit. "Pleased to meet you as well," he said with a crooked smile, pivoting his head to the left and cracking his neck. Jeremiah felt awkward and looked around the interior of the car. On the seat next to him, Brad Pitt looked up from the newest People's Sexiest Man of the Year issue for 1995. Newt Gingrich peered up at him from Time magazine. Jeremiah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his notes. He needed to keep his thoughts in order. The mind could sometimes rewrite history, and he wanted to get the details right. Since seeing the murder of his neighbor from his apartment, life hadn't been the same. Perhaps that experience had caused the change in his personality that he was struggling with. Trauma can sometimes steal something from your soul, and it takes real work to get it back. 6 months ago, he and Sarah saw the most brutality they'd ever encountered, happening only yards away from their bedroom window. Their eyewitness accounts would be the evidence necessary to bring a killer to justice. At 10:30 this morning, their testimony would seal the fate of a sadistic man. Luka Jovanovic had murdered 15 innocent people in as many years. Luka had been sloppy that day and slaughtered poor Mr. Michaels where others could see. He had been motivated by money initially, a failed robbery, but it soon turned to a need for something else. He had sliced Mr. Michaels from navel to throat. There was no sense to it, simply a desire to extinguish the life of a helpless old man. Jeremiah's palms were damp with nervous perspiration. He didn't look forward to seeing Luka Jovanovic again, even in a courtroom setting, or anywhere for that matter. He wasn't sure why he was anxious about it. Courtrooms were a controlled environment, complete with security, and Luka would no doubt be in shackles. He and Sarah would be safe, yet the feeling persisted. "What do you do, Jeremiah?" the driver asked unexpectedly. "Oh, you startled me. I'm a photographer, not a professional one. I just photograph the occasional wedding or engagement. In fact, I was just delivering a lovely couple their photos. They're staying at the Grand Hyatt for the week. My day job is in sales. My passion is behind the camera." "Photographer, very nice. You must have the eye I hear about," he said in his usual monotonous tone. "Well, I suppose I do. It does take a certain—" Nicola cut him off suddenly. "We are here, Mr. Benson, 107 Franklin Boulevard." Jeremiah hadn't even noticed they'd come anywhere close to the apartment. His mind was elsewhere. He looked through the opposite window and saw his gorgeous girlfriend standing outside their apartment. He had no idea how he got so lucky to land in this relationship. They met in a park years ago while walking and had been together ever since. She was leaning against the building and started walking toward the street. Sarah Richards was dressed in a gray jacket, camisole, gray slacks, and red high heels. Her athletic 5'4" figure pulled off the look well. She did her Pilates DVDs at least 3 times a week, and it showed. "You look great, babe," he said, with a hungry look in his eyes. "Thanks. You look good yourself, sweetheart," Sarah said. She was genuinely happy to see her boyfriend, even though the circumstances were not ideal. The way he loved her was everything she needed. He still gave her butterflies. She wasn't particularly happy to recount the murder she'd also witnessed months ago. Sarah sat down and dropped the clutch she'd been carrying. Jeremiah leaned over and planted a kiss on her lips. She noticed a large man in the aviators watching in the mirror. He shifted his head slightly and said, "Where to now, Mr. Benson?" "The county courthouse, please," Jeremiah responded. He furrowed his brow slightly and shook his head almost imperceptibly. Sarah, who knew Jeremiah very well, could tell something was bothering him. "What is it, babe?" she asked with sincere concern. "I don't know. Something feels a little off, but I'm not sure why." "Is it the big silent type at the wheel? He seems a little intense," she whispered to Jeremiah, covering her mouth with one hand. For all she knew, he read lips or had excellent hearing. Maybe, I don't know. Could just be the trial. He glanced at his watch and tapped the face of it. He really should get a new one. The damn thing was always losing time. "Hi, Nicola, do you have the time?" 10:10. We should be there very soon. I will need to go a different way. The city workers are blocking the lane, Nicholas said. While there was a utility truck parked in the outside lane, traffic was not impeded by the men working in the manhole. Jeremiah and Sarah looked at each other as their driver turned left onto a side street. Sarah was starting to share that uneasy feeling Jeremiah had mentioned moments ago. Sarah spoke up. This way it doesn't lead anywhere close to the courthouse. We need to be there for 10:30. Nicola ignored her. Hey, buddy, I'd appreciate you listening to what I'm... She was cut off by a deafening crash. As she was speaking, an elderly man wearing a dirty coat and torn jeans was crossing the road with all his earthly possessions in a shopping cart. The ram bar on the front of the taxi did its job and obliterated the cart. Cans, bottles, and articles of clothing were sent in all directions. The poor man was flung like a rag doll and landed on the pavement like a sack of meat. Juice from one of the cans splattered on the windshield in a sticky mess. What the hell? Exclaimed Jeremiah. Are you crazy? Yelled Sarah. Nicholas simply turned on the wipers and set to cleaning off the juice with a stream of washer fluid. He spoke in Serbian. Ne pomeritzje. Sorry, I don't understand, said Jeremiah apologetically. Sit back and shut up, he said, with more emotion than he'd shown thus far. Sarah looked back at the man the driver had just run down. He was not moving. I think you just killed that guy, she said in a panic. It was at that moment they both saw his right hand reach down to the passenger seat. Even before they saw the silenced 9mm pistol come into view, they saw the outline of the firearm reflected in the mirror from the man's aviator sunglasses. Do I need to shut you up myself? He asked as he pointed the chrome Czech CZ-75 with a silencer toward the roof of the Ford. Jeremiah and Sarah looked at each other in stunned silence. What was happening? Who was this guy waving a pistol? Shakily, Sarah addressed the gunman. We don't have anything of value. What do you want? You have more than you know, Miss Richards, he said, turning his head to look at Sarah over his shoulder. Wait, how do you know my last name? Sarah said to the driver. Jeremiah finally figured out why he was uneasy. Aside from crashing through a shopping cart and its owner, and brandishing a pistol, he realized that Nicola had called him by his last name as well. He hadn't told the driver his surname. He should have caught that fact right away. Testifying against Luca this morning had him distracted. The road they were taking was leading out of the city. Traffic was starting to thin. They needed to get out of this taxi from hell. Jeremiah and Sarah had to keep their heads on straight. They had been together for 3 years, and he intended to pop the question any day now. They knew each other's clues, almost like a secret language in a glance. Sarah stealthily indicated her intention to open her clutch. Jeremiah glanced toward the man's seatbelt. That wouldn't work. He looked at the magazines and had an idea. If they could coordinate a move simultaneously, they might have a shot at getting away in one piece. Don't do anything stupid, was heard from the driver's seat. It was stupid to attack a man with a pistol, but it was better than what they suspected would happen if they reached wherever this psychopath was going. Sarah moved her clutch to her lap and quietly opened the zipper. Thankfully, the road noise was enough to cover the sound of her retrieving her metal nail file. It wasn't much, but it could cause some damage if used effectively. Jeremiah was ready to make a move. They gave their knowing glances to each other and went for it. Jeremiah sprang forward holding the rolled-up magazines and pulled on either end against Nicola's throat as hard as he could. Nicola swerved and sideswiped a parked car. Nicola brought up his pistol. As he did, Sarah struck him in the forearm. He had the muzzle of the gun pointed at her face, but the force of her strike deflected the weapon. A loud pop noise, louder than either of them expected, sounded off. Jeremiah yelled in pain as the round ripped through his right deltoid and exploded the rear windshield. Sit down and do not move an inch unless I say so. If you try that again, I will put a bullet in each of your brains and dump you somewhere you'll never be found. Do I make myself clear? They nodded their heads rapidly. He cursed, Budale. Now toss that file and your purse out the broken window. Jeremiah grasped his wounded shoulder while Sarah tossed the file in her clutch out the back window as instructed. She turned her attention to her boyfriend's gunshot wound. She had kept a few tampons from her clutch and plugged the entry wound with one. The exit wound required 2 more to effectively stop the bleeding. "Please, mister, why are you doing this?" she pleaded. "My sister made me promise. When she died, I told her I would protect her son. Luca is all the family I have now. You understand, family is everything. Without your testimony, the police have nothing. I told you, you have everything. You have Luca's life in your hands. I must take that away from you. Besides, Luca did not do all the killing as the police believe. I will not let Luca take credit for that which I have done." In all the adrenaline-fueled excitement, neither of the unfortunate passengers had noticed Nicola's sunglasses were missing from his face. For the first time, they looked the man in the eye and saw his merciless determination in his expression. His eyes were black as the Crown Victoria he drove. His right eye was scarred, and it teared and wept slowly. His lifetime of pain was evident on his face. It was at that moment they knew they would not see tomorrow. Jeremiah wished he'd asked Sarah to marry him earlier instead of waiting 3 years. Sarah looked into her boyfriend's eyes and said, "I love you," without uttering a word. After 15 minutes, the Crown Victoria passed a section of billboards just outside the city limits, where traffic was almost non-existent. Sarah was the first to notice the patrol car partially obscured by vegetation and small trees. She glanced at Jeremiah, and he quickly tossed the bloody Time magazine out the broken rear window. The policeman was enjoying a coffee when he saw a magazine fly out the back of the black sedan that just passed him. He sat down his coffee and pulled onto the road. They were traveling the speed limit, but the missing rear windshield was enough to attract the kind of attention Nicola wanted to avoid. They continued another 30 seconds before the patrol car's lights and sirens sounded. Nicola voiced his frustration in Serbian again. "Sevjaslo govna," which roughly translates to "everything has gone to shit." It was bad enough to have this cop find Benson and Richards, but the dead taxi driver in the trunk would open up a whole new can of worms. "Keep quiet and no sudden moves," he demanded. They pulled onto the shoulder of the road and came to a stop. Nicola put the Crown Victoria in park and sat idly. The cop was a tall man with dark hair and a toned physique. His body language spoke volumes. He walked up to the Ford cautiously, hand on his sidearm, and addressed the passengers in the car. "Turn off the engine and exit the vehicle." Jeremiah and Sarah both turned their heads to see the cop touch the rear fender, as they often do, and come round to the driver's side door about 5 feet from Nicola. "Let me see your hands," the officer demanded. Nicola slowly lifted his left hand and cautiously raised it out the window. "Both hands!" he screamed as he unholstered his sidearm. Sarah and Jeremiah both spoke up at the same time. "He has a gun!" Officer Valentino's eyes went wide as he raised his weapon a fraction of a second too late. 3 rounds burst through the panel of thin sheet metal that comprised the driver's side door. Hot lead impacted the officer's groin, upper thigh, and diaphragm, and he fell backwards onto the road. The policeman managed to get a shot off that reduced the window to tiny cubes of tempered glass. His pistol lay just out of reach. Streams of arterial blood sprayed the side of the Ford and dripped onto the pavement. Officer Valentino applied pressure to the wounds in an attempt to staunch the bleeding. Nicola looked down at the dying man and to the blood coating the taxi sign and made the decision to stay seated. Normally, he would relish a chance to stand over a man and watch as he snuffed the life out of him, but he liked his shoes and didn't care to get blood all over them. "Please call an ambulance. I'm going to bleed out," pleaded Officer Valentino. Nicola lazily draped his hands over the edge of the open window and sucked his teeth. He wiped his brow and came away with a small smear of blood. The graze stung from his touch. A 1-inch abrasion decorated his scalp just above his temple. "Mirzam Polisku," he said. "Oh, I forget sometimes. I said, I hate cops." Nicola put a bullet through Valentino's right cheekbone, and the policeman was dispatched. Sarah sobbed into her hands while Jeremiah groaned quietly and held his wounded shoulder. Nicola drove for another 20 minutes without any further distractions. They approached a blind driveway in the curve of the road. The gate at the entrance of the drive was open. Nicola checked in both directions to see if anyone was around and proceeded down the lane. The country property was part of an abandoned farm. The ride was bumpy and gravel was flung as the tires rode over the lane. The old house was in disrepair and looked like it could have been a stand-in for the huge house from that Walton's TV show popular in the 1970s. Nicola drove past the front porch and around to the back of the house. He came to a stop just out of sight of the driveway. As soon as the car came to a rest, he was out the door and facing the car. "Get out and come around to me. Keep your distance." The couple followed his instructions and exited the vehicle. Jeremiah was holding his shoulder as before and seemed fatigued. He'd lost a lot of blood despite Sarah's quick thinking with the tampons. Some of that blood adorned her clothing as well. Nicola gestured with a pistol for them to walk toward a barn behind the house. "Open the door and step inside the barn," he said nonchalantly. Jeremiah grasped the handle, but it was a little stiff with his injury. Sarah helped him, and the barn door swung open. "Move, I don't have all day," was Nicola's cold response to seeing them hesitate at the entrance of the barn. It was occupied by mildewing bales of hay and various farm implements and pieces of machinery. Jeremiah couldn't help but imagine a chainsaw-wielding maniac enjoying it there. Nicola flipped a switch and several incandescent light bulbs lit up the interior. He gestured again to the back corner. There, in the dirt floor of the barn, were several mounds of earth, freshly turned. A hastily dug grave was partially completed at the end of the line of mounds. They approached the grave, and laying in a heap, just to the right of the hole, was Judge O'Connor. She had 2 bullet holes on either side of her chest. Sarah and Jeremiah both felt the air leave the room as they saw what their fate would be at any moment. "Do you have any last words? I'll give that to you at least." Nicola was standing only inches from the open grave meant for the judge. Sarah looked at the judge, then at their executioner, and to Jeremiah. She hesitated for a moment and then spoke. "Yes, I do have something I want to say," she said with a strange look in her eye. "Look out." As she spoke, she looked down at Judge O'Connor, whose demise wasn't as final as Nicola had believed. She kicked out with all her might at the back of his knee, causing him to lose his balance. Sarah took advantage of that moment to impale his foot with one of her 3-inch heels. Nicola roared in anger. These insignificant worms needed to die, right now. Just as he raised his pistol to Sarah's forehead, Jeremiah shoulder-checked the killer and sent him crashing into the open grave next to the judge. The force of Jeremiah's tackle sent Nicola's head just past the opening of the 3-foot-deep hole. When Jeremiah landed on top of the man, he was immediately reminded of the extent of his injuries. Pain exploded out from his shoulder and into his arm and side. It took him a moment to gain his composure and sit up. Nicola's neck had snapped, and his head rested in an unnatural angle. His eyes stared blankly at the side of the grave he was preparing for the judge. "Are you okay?" wondered Sarah. He stood, trying not to stand on the body of their captor. "Oh my God, that hurt. I'm okay, though." Sarah extended her hands and helped him up. The judge groaned in pain, but soon sat up as well. "I owe you two a debt of gratitude," O'Connor said weakly. The trio made their way to the farmhouse and located a phone. Naturally, they were not going to make it to the court for 10:30. 2 months later. The trial of Luka Jovanovic was scheduled for this morning. Judge O'Connor was still recovering from her injuries. Jeremiah had barely healed his body, but he wanted more than anything to heal his mind. He had almost lost the love of his life that day. At the conclusion of the trial, Judge George Chen sentenced Luka Jovanovic to the chair. As Jeremiah and Sarah walked out of the courtroom, both of them felt a relief that could only come from defeating their fears and personal demons. Right there, Jeremiah promised himself 3 things. 1. He would ask Sarah to marry him by the end of the month. Life was short, and he wanted to start living it. 2. He had his eye on a brand new car, and he would take Sarah car shopping tomorrow. And 3. He would never, ever ride in a taxi again. And welcome back. I hope you enjoyed my little thriller. It's what I enjoy about short stories is you can take them in different directions. This could be considered a bit of a horror just because of the violence that was inflicted by the killers. But of course, it was suspense and thrill as well. So as I write these stories, I hope to improve and make them longer and better and bring them to folks like you. So if you enjoy stories like this, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave your comments below. Also, turn on the notification bell because it's a good way to know when I post these stories. And let's see, I want to talk to my fans, as it were. So if you're one of the guys at the 7-Eleven and they visit regularly, thanks for watching. Bye for now. Oh, but come back soon. I'll be waiting.